Today is Wednesday, April the 28th, and this devotional commentary today is the third to the last of this study in the book of Numbers. Thank you so much for traveling with me on this chronological journey through the scriptures, and I'm looking forward to going into the book of Deuteronomy by the end of this week. But I am so glad to come to you today with our scripture reading, Numbers chapter 31 and Numbers chapter 32. I've titled this devotional, Safe and Satisfied is a Dangerous Place to Live. Now, to encourage you in the study, there's so much about Numbers that would be relevant to Israel and may not seem so much relevant to us, but it is nevertheless the foundation upon which we will continue to build as we develop a broader and deeper understanding of the scriptures. I want to assure you, don't get weary, for the journey through the scriptures is worth it, and it is enriching. Now, Numbers 31 brings us to a chapter that describes a war of revenge against the Midianites. Numbers 31 verses 1 and 2, the Lord comes to Moses, and one of his last acts as Israel's leader was that he was to command an army, to raise up an army of 12,000 men who were to war against Midian. Now, strategically, it was important for Israel to eliminate all the nations on the east side of the Jordan River, that they might continue their campaign into Canaan. But the Lord had determined to avenge Israel against Midian, because the kings of Midian had plotted against and employed Balaam the seer to curse Israel. But also in Numbers 25 and verse 6, it was the Midianite women that had enticed the men of Israel to sin, commit whoredom, and also to worship and offer sacrifices to their idol Baal. And thus the Lord ordered Moses to wage war against the Midianites. Now the Lord gave Israel's army of 12,000 a glorious victory, and not one soldier, according to Numbers 31 and verse 49, was lost in the battle. Israel slew all the men of Midian, including 5 kings, and guess whom else? Balaam the seer, whom we read they slew with the sword. As a result of the great victory, the spoils of war went to the men of Israel and the congregation of Israel. Now, the spoils of war included the women, the children of Midian, their cattle, their flocks, their sheep, and their possessions. They killed all the men of Midian. They burnt their cities and their fortresses to the ground. Well, returning from the battle, the soldiers were met outside the camp by Moses, Eleazar the priest, and the chief leaders of the tribes. Well, Moses saw the women of Midian in the midst of the spoils, and he was furious, for he remembered how they had wreaked havoc in luring the men of Israel to sin. And so Moses ordered, with the exception of the virgins and the little girls, the daughters, that all the women of Midian were to be slain, including every male, that is, every son of the little ones. Well, after 7 days outside the camp, a time of purification, those soldiers were reunited with their families, and then all the clothes, all the goods had been purified and were brought into the camp. Well, that brings us to Numbers 31, and the last verses of Numbers 31, beginning at verse 25, addresses the sum of all that had been taken by the victory and the distribution of that among the children of Israel. Now, in fairness, of the 12,000 men that went to war, half of the spoils would be awarded to them and to their families. The other half would be divided among all the congregation of Israel. And then finally, there was a tribute or tithe that was to be given to the priests, not only for them, for their families, but for the operation also of the tabernacle itself. Now that brings us to Numbers 32. Numbers 32, we find an unusual request. It deals with the division of the land on the east side of the Jordan River, that is outside of Canaan. 2.5 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh, petitioned Moses to assign them the land that was on the east side, reasoning that the land there was fertile and the grasses of the plains there would support their livestock. Well, Moses' first reaction to the request was swift, for he feared those tribes were deserting the nation of Israel and were shirking their obligation to assist in conquering the promised land. Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe immediately responded to Moses, calmed his concerns, and assured him that they were ready to go to war with all the other tribes in conquering Canaan. However, their desire, though, was for their cattle, for their wives, for their children to remain on the east side of the Jordan. Well, there was a compromise that was reached between Moses and those tribes, those 2.5 tribes, and it appears that all's well that ends well. Such, however, would not be the case. While those leaders and those tribes did go to war and they fought beside their brethren in Canaan, their decision to build their homes and raise their children short, that is, outside of Canaan, would later prove disastrous. Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh were not only geographically a distance from the other tribes, but they were also to become spiritually distant from the Lord in the generations that would follow. We will read later, 1 Chronicles 5 and verse 25, that those 2.5 tribes, they transgressed against the God of their fathers, and they went a-whoring after the gods of the people of the land. In fact, stopping short of entering into the land that God had promised them would prove to be a fateful decision, and it would also bring a great sorrow upon their children. They would not only be the first to face armies that came against Israel, they were also the first that would ultimately be taken into captivity by the Assyrians. I close with a lesson. No halfway, half-hearted service for the Lord will ever be acceptable. Choose to fall short of God's will, and you're going to learn a difficult lesson. And that is, be sure your sin will find you out. Let's pursue the Lord with all of our heart. Let's present our bodies, Romans 12 and verse 1, a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is our reasonable service. Let's pursue the Lord with all of our heart. I hope that you will join me tonight at 10:30, or at 10:30, tonight at 6:30 for our Wednesday night Bible study as we continue our study in the book of Proverbs. The Lord bless you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.